Reynolds, back on the live stream, back on the team stream. Thank you. Welcome back, Sam. How you doing?
Thank you for having me, Nick. Hi, Nick.
Hi. So yeah, 2 weeks ago, you joined me here on the stream, and we were talking about this article I wrote 16 years ago, if you can believe it, about Venus retrograde and race relations in the United States, different sort of events. Markers in the timeline, if you will, key events in that story, in that ongoing story. And so yeah, look at the end of the last stream, we were just closing the 19th century with Booker T. Washington and his Atlanta Compromise, and that was the last slide we were talking about. So we're going through this slideshow that I've made that's based on the article I wrote all those years ago. And we're going through that again today. We might finish it today. We might not. I don't know.
There may be a part 3 because I
exactly.
I want to chime in with some things I've done based on some of that research.
Yeah.
And so we'll get more into that. But yes, go on. I'm sorry.
Exactly. No, I'm thinking there very likely will be a part 3 because you also have a slideshow to show, which is sort of a response to what I've done. So I want to let people know, whether they saw the last stream with us or not, that if it seems like I'm sort of dominating the conversation today, it's because I'm presenting the slideshow and Sam's reacting to it. And that's just sort of that's ongoing from the last episode.
Right.
But then once I've run through this slideshow, then Sam will be presenting his, in which case he will be talking more than I will, and I will be responding to his work. So yeah, if it seems like one person is sort of taking over the conversation and from one episode to the other, there is an order and a logic to all this, and it's not.
Did you get a complaint about that?
I think one person just didn't understand that, we were doing, like, they just sort of tuned in and said, well, why is Nick talking all the time? Like, is it like I invited you here just so that you could, like, sit there, but which wasn't exactly true. I mean, you did respond to everything I was presenting.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe they didn't understand, like, we're doing a specific thing. All right. Anyway, with no further ado, the only other complaint I had was it took us like half an hour to actually get to the slideshow because we had all the pleasantries and chit chat. So yeah, maybe we'll spare those critics that agony.
I don't know. I mean, it's okay for humans to be human, right?
Yeah. I think so.
No one's paid for this. I mean, I want to weigh in with that. No one's paid for this. We're not wasting your time, right? And so, I guess I'm going to be the Scorpio, less diplomatic here. Like, if you, we're going to get to the information, but Nick and I have been friends also for 20 years. So some measure of that, I think, is also another lesson we're teaching about camaraderie, about relationships. We're not just here for you to consume information. We want to share information, but people don't exist just on the web for people just to feed. I want to say that because I think it's annoying.
Sure. I think some people like the sort of, the entertainment of just the banter and all that. There is more than just the astrology. But yeah, with all that said, point well taken, Sam. But we'll spare those who are tormented by the frivolous banter before the serious business of the astrology is at hand. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we'll jump back into this slideshow. And this is where we left off.
Right.
Although I think we pretty much had covered what this event was about, and you had weighed in on it because I know you have some pretty strong feelings about the Atlanta Compromise.
Yeah.
Shall we move to the next then? But this also involves, this is 8 years after the Atlanta Compromise. But this goes to show how, even, as you were pointing out, Booker T. Washington represented maybe the sort of the milder faction of the day, with, sort of the classic dichotomy of, you have the more sort of militant faction and then the more conciliatory faction. in human rights struggles and in the racial struggle in the U.S. And I mean, this is, I think, part of
Uh-oh.
slideshow. You know, sometimes happens. There we are. This is part of what you were saying, not to put words in your mouth, but that W.E.B. Du Bois was sort of like at this point and at this juncture was the more sort of militant voice. And although that would change later with Washington's death and then the introduction of Marcus Garvey,
Right.
Du Bois would become the sort of the more the milder voice between the two. Anyway, at this point, this is a police raid on a Booker T. Washington speech. So, despite the fact that he was sort of the more conciliatory voice in this movement, that he had his fair share of pushback as well, and this was quite a big sort of brouhaha in Boston.
Yeah, 120 years ago, almost exactly. It's just minus a day.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and around the same time, there was another one of these sort of white riots, if you will, a Bronx stabbing, some kind of racial interaction that led to a white riot generally became just this. These would happen from time to time. Excuse me. It'll come up again in 1919, where a mob of whites just go on a mass sort of lynching, if you will, or attacking random African Americans after some kind of altercation like this particular incident.
Right.
And then just moving over to the Blue Five, I've moved over to the sometimes we go to the exterior conjunction. There were a few instances of that in the last talk. There's going to be a few of them more because the Blue Five also comes into play quite a bit. So it's not a Venus retrograde, it's Venus direct, but it's making the same conjunction to the sun that the retrograde makes in the Red Five with all those other events. And this was something in Bellingham, Washington. A lot of this kind of stuff. There was something similar in Vancouver this same year, where there were attacks not on African Americans but on Indian immigrants or Chinese immigrants. Sometimes, people who were coming in as laborers, and they would have camps where they were staying while they worked, and then they would be attacked, by resentful whites or what have you.
Yeah, and I want to chime in here, especially for newer folks or folks who didn't have a chance to check us out last time.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question: what's this got to do with Venus, right? In terms of looking at this, and so what Nick talked about in his article 16 years ago, and then also in terms of what I've kind of also developed, is where Venus is a planet that relates to similitude and how we experience similitude. And when I say similitude, it's more so where we have a sense of what is like us. And by virtue of establishing, that rapport, you're going to also almost by default establish where you also have people that you reject or you refuse. And so one of the things that we've kind of seen is that as much as we talk about, ideas of justice, it really becomes about a consensus on what, who's the in crowd and who's the out crowd.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In many ways, that would have worked better being in the title of the article, that matter of consensus.
Mm-hmm.
Because the injustice end of it is sort of a byproduct of this other more Venusian function, indeed, where a given society will have a sort of unwritten code as to how it defines itself, a sort of a nationalistic code or a racial code, what have you. And it becomes this sort of accepted narrative. And then along comes some other group of people who, just by existing, disturb the sanctity of that narrative, if you will. Like suddenly, like, what? How am I supposed to believe this thing that I made up if you come into the picture and exist in front of my eyes? That completely throws my narrative into disarray, and I respond with irrational a reaction. So yeah, I think that's a big part of what Venus is doing here. It's part of that sort of that collective code that people will have in a given society, and what is, what is tolerable and what is not. And yeah, it can have to do with any number of things.
Yeah, because I think that just before you go back to the show,
Yeah.
what we're really kind of diving into is what constitutes us, what constitutes them. And
Mm.
I think one of the things that I hope we start thinking about collectively in our society through astrology or beyond is, you know, what's us. One of the fascinating things I think about related to the United States, and maybe Canada has a similar thing, is yeah, we talk about the country, we talk about the United States, we talk about Canada, but who really belongs, right?
Mhm.
And when I say who really belongs, who do we deem as belonging, in terms of benefiting from healthcare, benefiting from housing? Because when you look at the history, I can't speak about Canada as much because I don't know about this in terms of the intricacies of Canada. But in terms of when you look at the intricacies in the United States, you know, one of my mentors said this, and I don't know if you can see this as true as well. I mean, you guys do have universal health care. He said one of the reasons why we don't have universal health care is because of racism. White people don't want to take care of other people and their health needs. Now,
Mm.
is that absolutely true? I don't know, but it's always gotten me thinking. That's my thought.
I think it does work itself in to some extent in the whole American approach to sort of socialized any kind of care, not just medical care, but housing and so
Mm-hmm.
many of those issues that probably do play into the racial question. As far as like, look, Canada and universal health care, that's another. I mean, we have it in name. There's a lot of problems with the service here. I'm kind of embarrassed sometimes for Americans who look to Canada as being the shining example of what they could be. If you want to sort of envy a nation's healthcare system, envy Taiwan or Denmark, but by golly, don't envy Canada.
Okay.
It's arguably better than what the U.S. has. I'll grant that, but that's really not much of an improvement. Anyway, that's my that's my political statement for the day.
Right.
It's not everything it's cracked up to be, which is not. I mean, I'm in favor of a functional universal healthcare system, but that's not what we have in Canada. It's not entirely functional. All right, enough editorializing for me, and
Yeah. Let's get back
shall
to
we
the
get
show.
let's get back to the show. But actually, it's a really good point. I'm glad you made that interjection because it is important to understand why we're looking at Venus when it comes to this subject. All right. So moving on from here, this is another one of these. Now, we are in a sort of in a downtime. I am showing just some of these sort of big events that happen at these different intervals, but these aren't things like this. Like this was a bad lynching in Cumberland, Maryland, a town that I actually lived in. This is where Project Hindsight was based. This is what intrigued me when I saw this story because I could visualize where this event happened. It was just down the street from where we used to live on Washington Street in Cumberland. But yeah, so these events are somewhat run of the mill, but I'm just sort of tracking them because they fall into this rhythm that involves these other much bigger events. This was another one of these classic white riots. We're now in a red 5 in 1911, so it's July of 1911. And yeah, another one of these situations. I think this was at Penn Station. Some guys get into a fight, and someone pulls a gun, someone pulls a knife, someone pulls a gun, and yeah, things just get crazy from there. And then back to Booker T. Washington. This is the ongoing sort of the debate between Du Bois and Washington would get quite heated, and Du Bois published this paper, The Crisis, which had an international distribution and some amount of influence. For instance, in the African diaspora in Europe.
Yeah, it's still published today through the NAACP.
Right, right. Um, but he was basically sort of, this faction that existed between these two communities of activists was sort of breaking out into the wider world, and this open letter that Du Bois wrote to Washington supporters in Europe, and sort of making his case against him as it got uglier between them.
And can I just recap for the audience too
Yes.
what the nature of the cases are? So
Yeah, please.
Du Bois was, if not the earliest, one of the earliest grads from Harvard, and also got extended his education in Berlin, getting a PhD. So he believed very much in a key things. He believed in the benefits of education. So did Booker T, but more liberal education.
Mhm.
And W.B. Du Bois also believed that the benefits of that liberal education was to advance the civil rights of Black folk in America and beyond. Especially at this point that we're talking about the earliest 20th century, is that he saw it in this particular way. Whereas Booker T believed more in economic advancement first and primarily,
Mhm.
not with an emphasis on civil rights per se, but economic development, especially related to skills and building skill sets and trade development as the way for African Americans, Blacks to kind of advance. And because he felt that with economic development would come civil rights development, which is the very opposite of what W.E.B. Du Bois believed.
Right, right. And I would say, like, over time, Du Bois's um, sort of side of this argument would really come to define the movement as time went on. My sense of things is Booker T. Washington, although fashionable in his time, by the time you get to like the post-war generation,
First
uh,
World War, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that people have less time for Washington's approach and perspective, and that people want everything. People want change now. That they want the civil rights now. Um, okay, yeah, but thank you for clarifying that, because it was, yeah, it, like we're saying, it's kind of an ongoing theme where you have these two sort of factions with different approaches, different ideas of how to move forward. Oh yeah, I should have repeated my warning about disturbing images.
Yeah.
Um, we did begin the last time Sam and I did the team stream. We did want to warn you that there are some disturbing images here. So if this sort of suddenly came in front of you and you weren't expecting it, you have my apology. It is upsetting. It is offensive. Um, I'm not showing it here to offend, but just to expose. This was an event. This is also, again, not involving an African American, but it was a pretty big cause celebre at the time. This was a lynching of a Jewish man named Leo Frank. That also sort of came under the general reaction. This is at a time when there's a great resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and lynchings were really sort of exponentially increasing. And this was one that was really sort of the big story of the summer, if you will. And now we're moving into Red Summer. Now we're moving into this is more one of the years that that this whole timeline was created to examine. The 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 previous few examples are I mean, every event's obviously important in its own right, but Red Summer is like a real phenomenon, because what you had was, in the summer of 1919, a whole series of uprisings. Some of them were African Americans sort of fighting back and defending themselves. Some of them were sort of more white riot eruptions and these sort of mass lynching type situations. But it was a very explosive summer. This, of course, is the summer after the First World War has ended, and things are really, really, really hot. So this is the first off, one of the first sort of uprisings of this summer was July 11th of 1919 in Longview, Texas. And then a week later in Washington, D.C., there was a big sort of altercation between some servicemen and African Americans they came across in Washington, D.C. This turned into a pretty big brouhaha. July 27th, this is just a little over a week after that. This is an uprising in Chicago. There was the lake was segregated apparently, and I think an African American kid swam over to the white side, and then some whites got mad at him, and the child wound up drowning, and then people got furious at the child drowning, and it turned into a really pretty big tussle there. And now we're about a month later. Things have been going on all summer. I'm just showing some highlights. This is Knoxville, Tennessee. And again, a man gets shot, and then there was sort of a pushback from the local whites, and they were, it's one of these sort of white riots, indiscriminate attacks on African Americans and things like that.
There's a guy back there in a mask, in a ski mask.
In this picture, I don't see him. I don't see anyone in a ski mask. Sorry?
By the door? But
no. That's just a black man with a hat on.
Oh, okay. Are you? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. It's funny.
I think this is one of those days the Klein could go mask off, if you will.
Okay, well, I do want to weigh in and say something about this moment. I mean, in terms of Red Summer, you kind of alluded.
Please.
This is a huge moment in African American history, because this is when soldiers came back, having fought in World War I, having fought for the United States, and seeing how things were in Europe, how also in many ways they were received but treated by their countrymen. This was a moment where, soldiers like, wait, we fought for this country. Why are we treated so poorly and badly? And again, this draws in aspects related to Venus, in terms of how, not just in terms of value. I mean, self-worth is one of the modern connotations for Venus, but also I think here in terms of how they belong, or how we belong or don't belong, and how whites at the same time didn't feel like they wanted to change the sense of belonging. So I think this is significant. It was not just in terms of whites pushing against blacks, right? But it was also blacks resisting and pushing back against whites.
Yeah, different one. These different events in Red Summer, you have instances of both. Some of them are more sort of like the one in Chicago was really more African American sort of fighting back. Whereas some of these other ones are more sort of, one little altercation involving one or two African Americans suddenly becomes this big sort of, white riot against whoever is unlucky enough to be on the street at that moment. Those types of situations. So you're seeing all those different variants of conflict erupting over the course of this summer. But you're absolutely right. I mean, part of what's making this really tense is the fact that you do have black soldiers coming back from Europe, having fought for the country, having fought for freedom. The same thing would happen again with the Second World War. If anything, even more pronounced, because the Second World War, is really pronounced as a war for freedom, in a way that the First World War is never argued over in quite the same way. And so, I think another facet of Venus in all this is the idea of citizenship. I mean, you're talking about belonging, but that's the idea. If a man fights in uniform for their country, then they expect their country to sort of stand up for them, as as part of the relationship. So there is this feeling of having sort of devoted and put one's life on the line and fought in the war, and then to come back to the same old discrimination.
I want to address, well, first, hello to everyone who's kind of tuning in. Reverend Kai, B. Havens, San Morgan, Chelsea Collins. I don't know if you're seeing this. San has asked an interesting question: disturbing images. Who is disturbed? One of the things I do want to talk about, hi Kate, is that where this is coming from in terms of Nick kind of giving this caveat and trigger warning is that this also can be, disturbing for Black folk, right?
Yeah.
Like when one of the things that we talked about last time is that a colleague of ours showed a disturbing image of George Floyd's life being extinguished um, by Derek Chauvin, um, and some people who saw it, who were Black, were triggered by it.
This
And
was in the middle of an astrology presentation.
thank you, in
Yeah.
2020. So one of the things, that our colleagues said, which in different circumstances might have been understandable, like, well, I want to wake people up. I want people to know about this. But, Black people don't need to be woken up about this, right? We're traumatized by this in real life often. I've seen people gunned down and machete, so these not necessarily always under the conditions of racism, but having also endured racism, it's like I don't need to be woken up about that. So that's kind of to answer your question, Sam.
Yeah. I mean, that's all. I just want people to know that, since we are tackling this, really disturbing subject, that there's ugly imagery in there. And it's about to get a lot worse too. There's some other really bad images that are coming up in the slideshow. So yeah, I think the thing with the event, in 2020 was that it was still going on. Like people were out in the streets protesting the murder when this astrology talk happened and the image was shown. So I think part of the outrage was just the act of showing the image while we were still in the oven of it all. You know what I mean? These images I'm showing now are over 100 years old, but I mean they still have an impact. They're still disturbing, but it's not like it didn't just happen on CNN a few days ago.
Right.
So there is that to sort of temper the impact of it all. But anyway, there we are. I mean, moving forward, we're about to have some more really nasty images, if anything, even worse than
Disturbing
the one,
images ahead.
even the worse than the one we were just looking at, if that's possible. So take it or leave it, I guess. Okay, so this is Knoxville, Tennessee, August 30th, and then we move into. Oh yeah, there's also a Boston police strike, which winds up becoming sort of another one of these white riot situations, since the police aren't controlling crowds, that people are getting into big fights, and there's big sort of altercations between groups of whites and groups of African Americans and what have you. So yeah, that wasn't helping anything. And then, yeah, this is another big sort of white riot lynching. You can see this is, maybe one of the most disturbing images I have in the slideshow. So this is someone being burned alive, or being burned anyway. I don't know if they were alive when they were set on fire, if that matters. But this is Omaha. Omaha would become important again at the next Venus retrograde, or sorry, in Tulsa, rather. Tulsa, Oklahoma is the one that becomes important in Red One, not Omaha. I sometimes get the two of them mixed up. But yeah, this is Omaha, Nebraska, and this is a terrible lynching that happens. Another one of these sort of mass ones. And then this is Elaine, Arkansas. This is a sharecroppers meeting that is busted. You can see the headline there: Negroes plan to kill all whites. So that was the paranoia fueling the whites who busted in on this sharecroppers meeting. I think it was really kind of a union organizing type thing that was racialized, and yeah, things got ugly here as well. So it was quite the summer. And then in the middle of it all, this is just on the side. This is the first Red Scare, and a lot of unionized Russian workers are being rounded up and deported from the U.S. This mass deportation that's also happening at the same time. Oh, yes, and the Centralia massacre. So this is also, I think, there's an Armistice Day parade, and yeah, different factions with guns, and you get another one of these sort of. It becomes one of these sort of white riot situations with people just going crazy with their weapons and killing indiscriminately. Okay, and then this is the next Blue Five in 1923 in Oklahoma City, where all of Oklahoma goes under martial law because the Klan has gone just bananas. Now, at the previous Venus retrograde, 2 Venus retrogrades earlier, in the spring of 1921, there was a big, I don't have it in the slideshow, but there was a big riot in Tulsa that destroyed what they called Black Wall Street. You know, this really prosperous Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was totally leveled during the Red 1 Venus retrograde of 1921. But this is sort of following up for that in 1923. This Blue 5 is martial law being declared, so as to sort of curtail the Klan's rampage in the state. And then going back to immigrants and the way they're treated in the middle of all this. This was a very famous execution of 2 Italian anarchists, Sacco and Vanzetti, during the summer of 1927 during a Red 5. A lot of protests all over, just not only in the United States but all over the world, trying to save the lives of these 2 guys who may or may not have been guilty of what they were accused of.
Espionage.
Yeah. Murdering a security guard in the name of espionage, I think, was the actual charge. But anyway, yeah, it was a big deal at the time. And then, okay, this isn't quite at the Red 5, not quite at the Venus retrograde, but there is going to be another riot in Harlem not long after. But this is a Harlem riot. Someone's arrested for shoplifting, and people try to stop the arrest, and it becomes this big brouhaha, and 4,000 riot in Harlem, 1 killed is the headline there. Pretty famous event. And then that summer, there's a lynching. This man, Reuben Stacy, is lynched. Eleanor Roosevelt is trying to convince Franklin Roosevelt to introduce anti-lynching legislation, but Franklin Roosevelt is afraid of losing his Southern supporters, and so he resists it. And the closest he comes when Reuben Stacy is lynched in Florida in the summer of 1935. This is the case that Eleanor's using to really try to convince Franklin to go along with it. And even though he's personally amenable to passing a law like that, he doesn't dare jeopardize his political career, and the balance he's got to do with the South and by introducing such a law. So he doesn't do it.
Yeah, I think that's a blemish on his record, of course.
Yeah. Typically, it's cited as much amidst everything else that was happening in the 30s. And Eleanor was pushing very hard for it. Okay, now we're getting to the summer of 43. The Second World War is going on. Again, this isn't quite at the Venus retrograde, although this riot sort of continues into the Venus retrograde in the last days of the Black 1 interval before we get to the greatest elongation. And this is a fight between whites and blacks in a sort of vacation spot in July, and a fight over whether Belle Isle is integrated or not, and it becomes quite ugly. There had been a big riot during the previous Venus retrograde, early 1942, in the project Sojourner Truth projects, and that was sort of a housing riot. And I think Detroit was just during the war years was a real sort of hot spot for race relations. And then we're back to Harlem. So now it's fully on the summer of 1943. And this time the police have shot someone and people are really mad. Remember, there had just been another riot there 8 years earlier over police activity. And so, yeah, there's a major riot in Harlem in 1943. One of these really sort of famous ones. Yeah, so these are people sort of pushing back after police brutality, not unlike what we saw in 2020, I guess.
Or any other period, like in
Yeah.
uh-huh.
Yeah. And now we're into the post-war years, and it's 1951, and it's Chicago. Cicero is like a suburb of Chicago, and we're in this period now. This post GI Bill period. Now, I know the GI Bill is a little bit controversial when it comes to, the race relations in the United States. It wasn't necessarily fairly distributed, but you did get, some African Americans who fought in the war did get GI Bill benefits. So they got college educations, and then once they get their college educations, they get a good job, and when they have a good job, they want to live in a nicer house, and so they start moving into a neighborhood like Cicero. And the white residents of Cicero were outraged at this and pushing back. And so
Yeah,
this is something you saw a lot in the States, but the Cicero one was the one that sort of made this national story of um, yeah, you have now educated blacks trying to move into nicer neighborhoods, and other people pushing back and trying to stop it from happening.
and you're seeing this all around the country. So if you want to see something that's fictional related to the horror of it, I believe it was one of the streaming services, either HBO or probably was HBO Max.
Mhm.
They tackled this in a short series called Them. Um,
Okay.
and they're talking about integrating Watts, right? It's kind of hard to believe that at one point Watts was white,
Right.
but this is kind of like that story.
Mm.
Um, and I mean, this is something that continues pretty much into the 70s.
Yeah.
Some permutation, like my family, um, my actual birth family was the first black family to move into an all-white neighborhood, and this would be 1968.
Mm.
This is some 17 years later in Buffalo, New York,
Right.
and it wasn't a riot, but this also goes with something else, another response, which was white flight, which I guess we'll get to more,
Yeah.
but there was more the initial pushes
Yeah.
into other areas.
Yeah, and we're going to get into school busing as well once we get into the 70s, and
Yeah,
we'll see that fall into the red 5 pattern as well. Yeah, Cicero's by no means a sort of a unique event, nor are sort of uprisings, racially motivated uprisings. It's the ones that really seem to be defining of the event, and seem to be sort of bigger, louder, get more press. The Cicero one was the one that was getting national coverage, and was sort of the representative of this phenomenon happening at this time. I think that's a big part. It's it's in the public consciousness. So it's not just people in Cicero who are aware that it's happening. It's people all over the country and all over the world. Just some other events. I have some sort of more personal events that are that illustrate the sort of trouble that individual African Americans were going through at the time. Thelonious Monk. Now, 6 years earlier, during the Red One Venus retrograde in 1945, some police were going to arrest Thelonious Monk at he's a famous jazz composer and pianist. So some police were going to arrest him at a train station, and his friend Bud Powell, who's also a great jazz pianist, sort of stepped in and tried to protect Thelonious Monk, and he got hit on the head, with a club or whatever, and sustained these head injuries that really sort of messed up his life in a bunch of ways. He wound up in asylums, and it screwed up his musical career, which was very promising. So then 6 years later, Monk and Bud Powell are sitting in a car, I think close to Columbus Circle in New York, and some police approach them, and they find drugs which actually belong to Bud Powell, but Monk takes the blame for the drugs because Powell has already been through so much, really, protecting Monk. So now Monk steps in to protect Powell, takes the blame for the drugs, and winds up having his cabaret card suspended. which was like just, basically like putting any musician in New York out of work, because it meant he couldn't perform in any venue that served alcohol in the New York City area. So it really sidelined Monk's career in a way. For him to make any money, he would have to perform outside the city, and it was just inconvenient in a million different ways for him. And he didn't get his card back for, I think, another 7-8 years. So it really sort of messed up his life, and really, sort of over harassment mostly. And around the same time, this is kind of a famous event. Josephine Baker has been living in France, of course, all these years, but she comes to the States for a visit, and she wants to go to the Stork Club, and she's not allowed in. Now, of course, in France, Josephine Baker literally is a war hero. She was a really important spy for the French during the war, and she's like the really revered international figure. And she hasn't been living in America for like 25 years. So she's sort of sent back to this, segregated world. And she winds up sort of suing over being libeled, when she's denied service at the Stork Club. And so these are just different things that famous African Americans are dealing with at the time. Okay, now we're moving into stuff we know more about. This is probably familiar to most people. We're back at the Blue Five, and in Jackson, Mississippi, Emmett Till is a young 14-year-old kid from Chicago, and he's down there visiting family in Mississippi. And something happens at a local store. Either Emmett Till whistles at the white woman working at the counter, or says something somewhat scandalous, or whatever the case is. He gets himself in a lot of trouble, or he finds himself in a lot of trouble. I don't know how much of it was his fault or not, but he's he's in trouble for something. And in the middle of the night, these white guys come to his uncle's house, and they take him away, and he's never seen alive again. His body is found later, very badly mutilated. And at his funeral in Chicago, about a week or so later, his mother makes the brave choice to have it be an open coffin funeral, open casket, so that everyone can see how badly mutilated he was. And that photo is shown in newspapers all over the world, and it makes a real impact, and by the end of this year, the Montgomery bus boycott is going to start. And, it's often said Rosa Parks is thinking about that photo of Emmett Till when she refuses to give up her seat in Montgomery. So it's kind of it's one of these important events that sort of it gets a lot of attention and inspires certain people. For instance, Emmett Till was the same age as Muhammad Ali, who's, at this point also a young 14-year-old kid named Cassius Clay. But he sees what happens to Emmett Till, and he realizes, well, that could have been me very easily.
Yeah, and the woman who accused him, Carol Bryant Benham, really recently just died.
Right.
Earlier this year.
Wow.
Which she, was never brought up on any charges or but yeah, this is a very tragic death. I just saw yesterday, there's a film. I'm always resistant to watch films like this, but based on his life and death, just called Till.
Okay.
I'm curious to see it.
Yeah. I've read 2 books about it. Also, I find that, the dramatizations often are just sort of fall short. They're useful if you don't know anything about the story, but once you do, it's kind of hard to watch. But yeah, I might check that out too. I think it's especially, we're going to get to the next Blue Five in a minute. 8 years later, in 1963, where there's also a really, sort of big event that has to do with the loss of innocence, but we'll get there in a minute. First, we're just going to detour back to the Red Five of 1959. First of all, I just have that Billie Holiday dies. It's not necessarily, I mean, she was definitely a victim of police harassment and whatnot. But I just have her in there for.
Well, I mean, go back to that. I mean, I think there's
Yeah.
a little more significance to it. I mean, one thing I know, because you and I have talked about this, why you mentioned folks like the Thelonious Monk and Billie Holiday, is that this was your entry point
Yeah. Yeah.
to, studying Venus cycles, because you're into music, you're a musician.
Yeah.
And so, you study all forms of music. So you started noticing a trend
Yeah.
with particular musicians. So it's not like, oh, it's just like, oh, he just mentions, randomly Billie Holiday.
Yeah.
But it's also more so even her significance, especially when you have, as a blues singer, something like Strange Fruit,
Yeah.
you know, that song, in terms of talking about lynching
Yeah.
and particular things. So there is a larger significance to this than just like, Nick mentioning randomly Billie Holiday.
No, for sure. For sure. Yeah. Definitely all these things. I mean, there's a lot of these really important jazz musicians whose deaths, like their deaths sort of shatter the community at the time. And Billie Holiday is one of them. When she dies, there's something that changes about New York. There's something that changes in the Black community there and then when she goes. And it's funny. There's a lot of jazz musicians who died during the Red Five. I'm going to get to Miles Davis in a minute. He'll eventually die during the Red Five of 1991. Coltrane will die in the Red Five of 1967. Cannonball Adderley will die in the Red Five in 1975. There's something about it. It's a really big pattern where a lot of these really important musicians of the age died during this Venus retrograde, and I think it plays into how the community is growing and shifting from decade to decade, I guess, is one way to put it. Okay, and this is another one of these sort of this is one thing you'll notice is earlier in the 20th century, a lot of the examples I was showing you were these sort of white riots, where these sort of mass lynch mobs and whites sort of freaking out over some little thing and going on a mass attack. But now we're seeing sort of the thing that's becoming more popular now, which is more the Black community pushing back. Someone gets harassed by the cops, shot, either arrested or shot or something, and then it blows up into a big sort of community pushback against the policeman. And that's what's happening here in the Bronx. And this is the kind of thing that'll sort of happen more as opposed to the earlier examples. Right. And this is also, this is another one of these famous events. This was an event that was, on the front page of newspapers and what have you. Miles Davis was performing at a nightclub in New York, and he was standing outside. He helped a friend of his, a white woman, get a taxi, and she got into a taxi and drove away. And a cop saw this happening and told Miles to, move along. But Miles Davis was literally standing in front of the nightclub that had his name on the marquee, and he's like, "I'm not moving along. I'm performing here. This is where I'm working." And the cop hit him, pulled out his nightstick and hit him. And there was a big court case. Eventually, Miles did sue the city, I believe. But it was an important symbolic event because he was, standing up to the policeman. Later on, Hugh Masekela, a jazz musician from South Africa, would tell Miles that this story really inspired them in South Africa. Just the idea that, if a cop harasses you, you stand your ground and stand up to him, even if it means a nightstick on your head. So yeah, this is just another one of those sort of events that I'm talking about. And this was, again, another sort of similar thing. The same week, Chuck Berry was arrested for kissing a white girl. A few months later, he would be arrested on a Mann Act charge. You know about the Mann Act, Sam?
The Mann Act?
Yeah.
What's that? With alcohol? No. What is that dealing
No,
with?
the Mann Act was created in the 1910s specifically for Jack Johnson, who was the Black heavyweight champion of 1910, 1912. Basically, it makes it illegal to transport a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. But it's really dog whistle for, Black man traveling with white woman. If they cross a state line, then he must be pimping her. That's the essence of the
Oh, wow.
presumption of this law, right? So that's at this point he's just arrested for kissing a white girl, but a few months later, Chuck will actually be in jail for a few years on a Mann Act charge because he transports a woman from one state to another, and that presumption is made that he's trafficking. Chuck Berry might be, look, a lot of black men get sent to jail for no good reason in the United States. Chuck Berry's luck is much better than most when they wind up in this situation, because he's going to be in jail until 1963. But when he comes out of jail in 1963, he'll find that these new British bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones have been recording his songs and putting them on their records, which sell a lot, and he gets royalties from those. Literally, by the time he gets out of prison, the Beatles and the Stones have been recording his songs. So we're,
And he got royalties, but did he get suitable royalties? Did he get royalties?
Oh
that,
yeah. I know there's a lot of ugly stories out there in the music business, but no one took a dollar from Chuck Berry that he wasn't entitled to. No, he got paid for all that.
That's good.
Yeah. Later on, John Lennon wrote a song called "Come Together" that used some of Chuck Berry's lyrics, and Chuck even sued him for using his lyrics, and that was paid. So even when they did try to do something sneaky with his work, he got paid. He knew what he was doing.
I mean, that's also the era. I mean, one of the things why I bring up this question, and I think some of the audience knows this, this is also the era where a lot of Black recording artists were making music, the 50s.
Yeah.
And then having it redone by white artists.
Yeah.
And not getting the recognition. This made Pat Boone's whole career.
Yeah.
One example.
Well, that's that's the funniest bit, because Little Richard's song "Tutti Frutti" is about a rather graphic sex act.
Right.
So, and by no means I like not the not like the what's the word I'm looking for? Not the missionary position, shall we say?
Right.
So something quite out in left field.
Right.
And so when Pat Boone was singing about Tutti Frutti,
right.
covering Little Rich has no idea what he's actually saying.
Well, it's actually, and I encourage people to listen to the original for Hound Dog.
Oh yeah, Big Mama Thornton.
So to hear Elvis's version, it was like, that's pretty tame. Compared to Big Mama Thornton's original.
That's
so
right.
Again, this is that era where we're dealing with, which is interesting to kind of look at this through the lens of Venus, through music, because one of the things I shared last time, and then I'm going to go more into when we get to my slideshow, is that when I start talking about the astrological destiny of African Americans, one of the central points that we can see is Venus. And the reasons why we talk, or at least I talk about Venus so much. So it's really interesting.
Well, yeah. I mean, you have to think that, and this was true already in the 50s with all these, with all these Black music artists, sort of, gaining a foreign audience. What's happening is these, American records are winding up in England, and then these British kids are hearing these blues and rock and roll records and mimicking them and learning the style and yeah, that's going to be a big sort of phenomenon. But it's something that carries through to hip hop culture today. I've lived all over the world, and you're in the Netherlands, and all these Turkish kids are wearing, FUBU clothes and acting like they're hip hop MCs and what have you. I mean, it's a totally international phenomenon. It's the singular most influential culture in our day by far.
Yeah, I mean, you also have the influence related to the blues, and just seeing musical icons that also go into the Caribbean, in terms of the islands, that also influence Bob Marley and some of his sound, and that sound then also gets exported to England. Like the bands that we love, that I think I shouldn't assume for you, like the Police, right?
Yeah.
The police are heavily influenced by ska,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Reggae. Yeah.
So there's all these different ways in which, this proliferation of black music starts to, going into South Africa,
Yeah.
change the world.
Yeah, no, South Africa's still got a really vibrant jazz scene. Jazz music was making a huge impression in South Africa, precisely, for these same reasons. It was showing what was possible, and it was something that people took to very easily, very very easily. All right, so we're moving into the '60s, and things are moving quickly. Um,
Wow.
so so yeah, this is a blue 5. This is the March on Washington. Notice that you have Venus conjunct the Sun and Uranus. And I'm just going to break the chronology for a minute here, because you'll remember that I showed you last time we spoke. I showed you a slide. Where is it? There we are. I showed you this. In 1883, Frederick Douglass gave a talk when the Sun was conjunct Venus in Libra, but Uranus was in Virgo. And it reminds me in some ways of what you see here when you get the external conjunction of Sun Venus in a blue 5 interval alongside Uranus, close enough to Uranus. It sort of reminds me of that to some degree, and this is 80 years later. But aside from that, this is, the speech probably doesn't need too much introduction. It's one of the most famous speeches in the history
I
of
have a
speeches.
dream today.
Yeah.
I mean, this is also the day, the day after, depending on how you want to look at it, that W.E.B. Du Bois passes away.
Right.
And again, we've kind of talked about the significance of W.E.B. Du Bois, which really, I mean, you and I probably could do a whole show on him alone.
Right.
Because his long life really arcs the development in a lot of ways of thinking, the maturation of certain thoughts in African American history, pretty much through the late 19th century all the way through the mid 20th century. And why it becomes critical, like his death, I mean, it was something that was talked about, and passed, and acknowledged that day with that March on Washington. People, the old man died, the old man has passed, and everyone knew who the old man was. They were talking about Du Bois and the significance of that, which must have felt for them like the passing of a torch.
Yeah.
And here we're talking about Dr. King, who at that point, I mean, he is roughly 34, 35 years old.
Yeah, he's 34 here. He's 34.
Yeah, 34 years old. A lot of people don't realize, Dr. King died when he was 39. Like he's a
really young
man.
Yeah.
And to kind of have this on his shoulders is a significant moment. And the other thing I like to mention, well, I guess it just went out my mind. I was like thinking about, Du Bois. And when I talk about the arc of his development, one of the things that we can talk about now, we mentioned earlier how he was at odds with Booker T. Washington, and then became at odds with
Marcus
de facto
Garvey
protege of Booker T. Washington, who became Marcus Garvey. But actually, W.E. Du Bois ends up dying in Ghana, basically feeling America is hopeless, essentially coming to the same position that his nemesis, who was Marcus Garvey, had come to some 30 years before.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to see this kind of development, and looking at Venus in her, Casimir, or close to it.
Yeah, I think I've got them.
Look at your damn library. Wait, what? You got 18,000 books?
No, some of those are samples. Don't go crazy. I have these 2 volumes by David Levering Lewis. Yeah,
I have that.
I have these in print as well, but I have them on the Kindle. So yeah, they're really, really excellent double biography there that covers the 2 halves of his life. Yeah, some of these are samples. I don't quite have that many books, although
Well, still, man, wow.
I do have a lot. I'm kind of a book nut. Um, but yeah, I highly recommend that double volume biography by David Levering Lewis is
Mhm.
really fantastic. All right, so it's the March on Washington, but there's also I was alluding to this when I was talking about Emmett Till. There's also this terrible event where a bomb in a Birmingham church kills 4 little girls. So as if, what happened to poor Emmett Till wasn't gruesome enough. This was sort of, yeah, and you can see this came on the heels. This is like just a little over 2 weeks after the March on Washington. So this is how the white establishment responded to the way things were advancing. Um, yeah, I have no words. Okay, so it's 4 years later. We're back in the Red Five. Things are getting very hot with the Vietnam War, and Muhammad Ali is found guilty of draft evasion because he doesn't want to go to Vietnam. It was during the previous Venus retrograde in early 1966, the Red Four of early '66, that his draft status was changed, and he was told he had to, report, and he was fighting it in courts. And a year and a half later, he's found guilty of draft evasion, and he loses his heavyweight title, and he's kind of thrown into the
Passport.
wilderness. Yeah. And his career is reduced to, well, I know he acts in a stage play, and he's trying to do other things to sort of keep himself afloat, but he really just loses everything, and it's going to be a few years before he can really pick himself back up. The next Red Five in 1975 will be the Thriller in Manila. But anyway, here we are. So the 1967, it's kind of like the summer of 1919. They called it the long hot summer. There were uprisings sparked all over the country. This was one in Newark, quite a famous one, July 12th, 67. Following a cab driver's arrest, you can see, this poor little kid here with a bunch of gun-toting soldiers coming at him.
And I believe this has been dramatized in the prequel to The Sopranos. I didn't watch it, but
Okay.
Newark,
Right.
Yeah. And they were filming, and so if anyone has watched whatever it's called, with young Tony Soprano, and this is dramatized, and so this is like a key moment. And then I can't recall all that you're going to cover in just a second.
Mm-hmm.
This is the summer before I'm born, and one of the things I remember, there were riots and different things happening in different places as well. And then that also extends into 1968, especially, which I think you're going to get to when Dr. King is assassinated. But
yeah, I'm gonna come back now. King isn't assassinated during a Red Five; he's assassinated during a White Four. But I am going to come back to that sort of after I run through all the Red Five. So yeah, King is going to be assassinated. Here we are, July of '67. He'll be killed in April of '68. We'll be skipping that for now, and then sort of coming back to it once I complete this Red Five thing. So just 2 days after Newark, this is another riot in New Jersey. You can see this poor kid got shot. There was, I think it started with a brawl in a diner, not unlike the sort of the viral clips we see happening in Waffle Houses across America. It exploded into violence, and things got ugly again. I mentioned, I showed Billie Holiday died earlier. This is when John Coltrane dies. It's another one of these sort of seminal moments in the community. And then moving back into the riots, this is the Detroit 12th Street riot. This is a very famous riot in 1967 that happens in Detroit, really destructive. Remember, we've already seen a few other events happen in Detroit. The city is famous for this particular riot is famous for so many things. I've read a few books about it. There's the Algerian hotel massacre story where the cops just outright executed a few men for like no reason whatsoever in a motel room. But yeah, this was just a really, really brutal riot, one of the most in
I mean,
American history.
people have to understand the significance. I mean, we're talking about particular isolated moments, right? But
Yeah.
it's important to understand the significance of these moments in the larger pattern of civil rights history.
Hmm.
So these riots, as they begin to happen, especially in a critical city like Detroit, this is the beginning of white flight, where people are fleeing from Detroit. I'm going to also get into some controversy because we talked about Mr. Frank, who had been lynched.
Yeah.
So this is the beginning also of, as we start to go into riots in different parts of the country, this is also the beginning of some measure of the breakdown in Jewish-Black relations that happens during the civil rights movement. Someone asked me to talk more about like my history in Buffalo um, related to it. And it's not so much about, my family moving into an all-white neighborhood, but my mom used to be a cleaning woman in Jewish homes, and she would talk about, kind of where some measure of this anti-Semitism in the Black community came
Mm.
from. And some of this came from very complicated situations like this. You're like, well, what do you mean? Well, as people rioted, one thing to realize is that a lot of these cities, whether we're talking about New York, Detroit, other places, the people who cohabitated in the quote unquote ghettos with
Mm.
Black folk, a lot of them were Jewish proprietors and Jews.
Mm.
A lot of Jews actually experienced their businesses, homes being burned down during these particular moments.
Mm.
Now, some measure of that was feeling like, well, you know, are you, many Black folks going with like, well, are you really with us? Whether they actually were with us or not. Um, and no, it's kind of the nature of what happens in terms of the Jewish condition, at least in the United States, where yes, you're white, but not white enough.
Mm.
And so a lot of Blacks built up some measure of resentment also toward Jews, deserved or undeserved, whether you want to evaluate that or not. So this moment that we're seeing here with these riots in Detroit taps into so many different things I'm sure you read about in
Yeah.
terms of how the police are dealing with um, largely Black institutions and people and civil rights, how Blacks are dealing with each other, how Blacks are dealing with other groups who are cohabitating with them,
Mm.
whether those be natives, indigenous folks, whether those be Latinos, as
Mm.
well in terms of the movements and the activation that starts to happen with that, and then also with Jews.
Yeah.
So again, this is like a critical moment for those who are ostracized at the same time trying to find their way in.
Yeah, I mean these uprisings are notorious. I mean that's something that you often hear is uh, you hear that chorus of why are they burning down their own homes? Why are they burning down their own stores, their own schools? It tends to happen. These uprisings happen in the neighborhoods people are living in. So certainly, if you have people who aren't Black who are living in the neighborhood, their homes are being burned down alongside the Black people who happen to be living in the neighborhood, and they have their homes burned down, even though so it's something that's happening to a lot of people. But when it suddenly happens to someone who isn't Black, then it optically it looks like more of an assault as opposed to you just being in the wrong place at the wrong time,
Yeah,
which is largely obviously what it was. I think they were just burning down whatever was there. And if it happened, if the family was Black, well, they lost their house. If the family was Jewish, they lost their house.
right.
At this point, it's not anything anyone can control. That's part of the situation. Yeah, but this is a famous riot. There's all kinds of literature on this particular event. Okay, and this is another one I can just sort of run through again. There's another jazz musician being targeted and needlessly arrested and harassed. The great composer Charles Mingus. This happens to him at that point. And with it being 1967, we're also the Black Panthers are now a thing. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale started them in October of 1966. So this is like a year into their founding. In May of 67, they famously turned up at the state capitol in Sacramento, with guns, exercising their Second Amendment right. And by this point, in October of 67, towards the tail end of this Red 5 interval, Huey Newton gets into a shootout with the police, and he's injured and arrested, and he'll be in jail for the next few years. And the cries of "Free Huey" posters and pins and slogans and what have you becomes a familiar refrain over the period of the late 60s and
Look at
early
that T
70s.
square, and also we're looking at a lunar node return for,
Yeah.
because I know I'm born just to
Not long after this.
not long after this. Also, you got a Mars square to Saturn and the ascendant.
Yeah.
It looks like you have a very specific time.
Yeah.
3 in the morning.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. That's from the police report. Yeah.
you got
Yeah.
Regulus for the moon.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this is a pretty significant moment.
Yeah.
But go
And
on.
Huey himself had natal Venus retrograde. He was born in early 1942. He's a red 4. So he's got Venus retrograde. And Eldridge Cleaver is a red 5. And I think he's about to get into some shooting event that has him running, like leaving the country. I think that happens in January of 68. He's going to get in some police trouble and have to leave the country for a while. So now we're at the Blue 5 of 1971. And George Jackson is he's an inmate, but he's also an author. He wrote a book called Soul Dad Brother, which is sort of a diary and expose about the race relations in prison and the American prison system and things to that effect. And on this day in 1971, he's shot and killed by prison guards at San Quentin, ostensibly because he was supposedly trying to escape. That's the story given. But his death then sparks the Attica prison riots. It spreads out and becomes this big phenomenon. So that just as Mars is going to be stationing direct, and we have this Sun Venus, we're in the Blue 5 again, the famous Blue 5, Sun Venus conjunction, and there's this the Attica prison riots. Really huge prison riot. A bunch of people wind up shot. Prison guards and inmates lose their lives in this, and really brutal.
Leading to a lot of different quote unquote reforms and changes in prison systems.
Right.
So this is
All right. Now we're 4 years later. It's 1975. First off, there's the Pine Ridge Reservation FBI shootout. So the FBI find themselves on a reserve in Pine Ridge where they're not welcome, and a shootout breaks out. And this leads to this big sort of standstill that goes on forever. And a whole this sort of turns one thing into another. I can't even go into the whole story because it just keeps going and going.
I imagine,
sort of
I don't know.
from this.
I mean, when I was doing my research on policing, I came across, we talk so much about the development of policing related to, Black Americans. But one of the things I discovered in the United States, a lot of advances related to policing actually relate to indigenous folk.
Right.
Have you found in your research, Venus cycles related to indigenous folks, or that's
I do. That's a whole, I mean, I put this one event in here because it's a red 5 one, but there's a bunch of others when you go back to the 19th century and what they refer to as the Indian Wars, for want of a better term.
Right, which went on forever.
It went on forever. There are a lot of key events that occur during, Venus retrograde. Like Custer's famous Last Stand, that's a red 3. And Wounded Knee, that's a red 2 in 1890. A lot of those really sort of signature events in this ongoing war between indigenous Americans and the American state, the American police state.
Yeah, I wonder what we would find with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, with the creation of that, if we would see that there's a Venus cycle, what Venus cycle that would be in.
Yeah, the actual creation of the bureau, I can't say off the top of my head, but definitely, like that's something we can go into in a later conversation. I can take you
Yeah,
into the
of course.
database and we can look at some of the different events that happened, especially like I said in the 19th century, when there was so much fighting going on. They were just sort of perpetually at war with one tribe or another. And
Yeah, one of the,
there is a lot of Venus retrograde stuff that you can pull out of there for sure.
going back to George Washington and the creation, I mean, literally not the creation of George Washington, but the creation of these things. After the war against the British, it was actually against, the creation of the Department of War, right?
Mm-hmm.
Really starts with the advancement of against the Indians. It wasn't even war.
Yeah. I mean, look, the main reason, like there's one part of the Revolutionary War that Americans don't really learn in their version of the history.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is, okay, so the British were charging taxes, and since they didn't get to vote for the taxes, that's deemed unfair. And and that's all well and good. It should be important for people to be able to vote for the taxes they pay. But the Britain wasn't just sort of taxing them to like take their money for no reason. The reason they were getting taxed so heavily was because British soldiers were protecting American colonists from the Western frontier, from Indians on the Western frontier, and whites kept encroaching. It's not unlike what you see in Israel today.
Encroaching into Indian territory,
right? And then
and that's why a lot of colonists really resented the British, because they felt like that land should be theirs.
Right. The British literally, like, because when you had what you call in the States the French Indian War, what we call the 7 Years War, generally speaking, the British had Indian help fighting the French in that war, and so they promised the Indians that colonists wouldn't move beyond the Appalachian Mountain Range. They would stay east of the mountains. And they had their soldiers stationed there to protect that frontier. But yeah, Americans would resent this and would encroach on Indian land over the mountains, and that would cause trouble. And so this is what they were being taxed for, was their protection, because folks kept encroaching on Indian land. And breaking this treaty that the British had set up. And that's how you wind up getting people complaining about taxes and Boston Tea parties and everything that ensues.
Even in Common Sense, and Thomas Paine's Common Sense, he talks about how that land should be theirs.
Right.
So it's an interesting thing. I mean, we probably could do a similar correlation.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it was more than that. B. Havens is saying, I understood it was to repay the cost of the French and Indian War, 7 Years War. It was also just like Nick is saying, to stop the encroachment, because soldiers still had to be there.
Yeah,
because the colonists felt like they were entitled to that land.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and now we're back in Detroit, and
there's a lot. I mean, Detroit is central.
Detroit is really
in Black history. I mean, from music, Motown, to just in terms of Fred Hampton, all kinds of things surface related to Detroit. But
Fred Hampton was in Chicago.
You're right.
Yeah. He was natally a red 3. He's shot during a blue 4, so he's not in this particular slideshow. But I do have like a sort of history of the Black Panthers and different members there. But yeah, this is a car burglary that police get called, and then you get an angry crowd, and one thing leads to another, and you wind up with a big. Again, this is now more of a Black uprising. The white riots that were happening, for instance, in 1919, they don't happen quite like that as much. Until maybe we get to places like Charlottesville 2017. But in this era, they're not happening as in the same regularity or numbers that Black uprisings are happening at this point. Oh yeah, and here's just another jazz musician dying. Cannonball Adderley dies in 1975. Everyone who played on the horns in Kind of Blue died during a red 5, so it's kind of peculiar. All right, this is the Louisville school busing protest riot. So school busing around this time is introduced in some cities like Louisville, Boston, cities all over the country where people are sort of this is becoming a big brouhaha. And I guess this is where you are getting some white rioting, if you will. Although they're not necessarily lynchings, but they're really unpleasant standoffs involving kids, and people being really, really, really awful. So yeah, this was a big bunch of ugliness going on all over the country as this Red 5 was happening in school busing.
Yeah, this is a huge moment, not just in terms of integration and
Mm-hmm.
issues related to integration, but I worked for an institution called the Fund for the City of New York
Mm-hmm.
that's trying to figure out the logistics. I mean, it was commissioned to figure out the logistics of how to accomplish this busing, with kids. Because you have to think about, and we may not think about it now because it's like we're just so used to it. How do you coordinate getting enough buses, the routes, everything else in order to kind of manifest this? Now, the Fund for the City of New York also becomes, this is where it does get a little bit into my personal history a little bit. It it becomes an institution that then presents an idea to the state to bring out the lottery. Now, my father was, I think you know this, Nick. Some people on Twitter know my father was an organized crime. Didn't do drugs, but he did the numbers. And
Right.
the numbers are the precursor to the lottery. And what that is on the street. You have people, you have number runners who, collect money from people based on playing particular numbers, just like we do now. It was completely it was a racket run by the mafia and by the mob. And then people got paid with that. But this company that I worked for, the Fund for the City of New York, doing tech training, they were instrumental in starting to figure out some of the logistics related to busing. And it was a model that was used across the country.
Okay.
So this goes into a lot of different things beyond just integration.
Right. Interesting. I didn't realize that. Yeah, so this really is sort of a reordering of a sort of social fabric and the way things have been done for decades and decades, and creating this new world. Okay. And from there, okay, this is just another little music thing. The first hip hop hit came out during a Blue 5. It's not really relevant to anything, but I just have that in there for some reason.
Wait! Stop! How are you going to do that? How are you going to say that it's not relevant to anything? What do you mean
Well,
it's not relevant?
I mean, it's not uprising. So I wanted to get us to the end of the slideshow.
I understand. I mean, are we at the end of
Okay.
the slideshow? No,
No,
right?
not by any measure. That's why.
I
But
know we have
okay.
a long way to go. I mean,
Yeah.
this is pretty big. I mean, this was huge for me.
Yeah.
I
yeah.
remember this, surfacing. I mean, you probably do too.
Oh yeah.
And hip hop, and we're at the 50th, going toward the 50th anniversary of it. Hip hop, it's interesting to kind of look at hip hop's emergence quite similarly to we have the emergence and development, not just the World Wide Web, but also in terms of the internet, the proliferation of the internet. The internet was created probably at least 15 years before this, but this is where it starts to enter more the mainstream. A lot of people don't know as we're going into the 80s, hacking, CompuServe, the ways in which we're looking
the
for
phone freaks and all that.
We're looking
Captain
for
Crunch.
Yeah, we're looking for connection here. So these are all these big moments.
Yeah, no, this is definitely, and I do find that the Red 5 and the Blue 5 tends to turn up in a lot of really important moments in the history of music. And so this is included in this, for that reason, because this really is this genre that until this record comes out, I mean, hip hop is something that happens, in block parties. You'll have DJs in the Bronx or Queens or whatever, performing what today we would recognize as a sort of hip hop MC role. But for this to just actually turn up on a record that everyone's hearing, especially up in Montreal where I was, it was as big there as anywhere else. So yeah, it's really the beginning of hip hop becoming this phenomenon that exists just outside a few isolated neighborhoods
in New York, right?
Yeah. All right. So there you go. We're not going to just zip through that, but
Right.
anyway, moving right along. These are more sort of prison riots. I showed you Attica earlier. This is one that happens in Oklahoma, in Conner, Oklahoma, and yeah, just another. Since I had Attica there with the blue 5, I thought I would include some prison riots that occurred at other red 5 intervals, and they do tend to be, this one I know was a sort of racially motivated rampage. This was also kind of a big story at the time. This was a graffiti artist named Michael Stewart who was beaten by the police for no other reason other than having, spray cans. And I think he was doing legit art, or maybe he was just tagging. But yeah, he was shot for no good reason by police at a subway in New York City. And that same week, we have Vanessa Williams becoming the first Miss America. Yeah, I throw in some of these other events that
Black Miss America.
The first Black Miss America. Did I say the first Miss America? Okay.
You did, yeah.
Just goes to show. Yeah, I'm just including some of these events because they add. It's like with the Sugar Hill Gang. This just sort of puts you in the time, in the era, and you have some sense of like some of the other developments that are going on. Oh, one thing I should have had in here that wasn't in the slideshow was. I guess we'll come to it in 91, but in 1967, Thurgood Marshall was appointed the first Black Supreme Court justice.
And what was that? A red 5, or what was that?
During a red 5, yeah. During a red 5 in 1967 is when Thurgood. I forget why he's not in the slideshow. I meant to have him in here, and I just don't have him in the slideshow, but he should be. In September 1967, during a red 5, Thurgood Marshall becomes the first Black Supreme Court justice. And also during a red 5, you have Vanessa Williams becoming the first Black Miss America.
Yeah. And I guess we're going up on a Venus return for that moment.
Yeah.
And it's a Venus and Leo, no less.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting moment.
Mm-hmm.
I see that someone has a question, Reverend Kai. Just ask your question. We're not going to call it. You got to put it in the chat.
Okay, so what's going on? What's the question?
Someone has their hand raised, Reverend Kai.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just put the questions in. We can't. Yeah, we can't. All right, so if you want to go on.
Okay. Yeah, I see her with her hand up. I see them with their hands up, but I don't know what that's about. So
yeah, I don't know what the.
Okay. Oh no, I was saying I also had family that ran numbers. Oh,
ran numbers. Yeah, that's kind of a thing. So that's cool. Right. Yeah.
Look at all you guys, all you gangsters in my
involved.
all these gangsters in my live stream.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie, for clarifying. Okay. Right. DJ Scott LaRock. Yeah.
Yeah, KRS-One. So this is
Boogie Down Productions. Yep.
Yeah, Boogie Down Productions. Yeah, and his murder is like sort of what like the first. I mean, we're going to get to Tupac later and things like that, but this is an early casualty in the hip hop community, and yeah, Scott LaRock's murder was quite the big deal at the time, quite the cause célèbre.
Yeah, and this sparks Boogie Down Productions and KRS-One, and the outrage related to his passing. Yeah,
all of that, because he only did 1 or 2 records at the most with KRS-One before he was killed.
That's correct. They were just getting started.
Yeah.
That year, pretty much.
Yeah, I think it's just that one record that I know. Mm-hmm. All right, 1991. I was in Europe when this happened, so I only sort of learned about it later. But this is the Crown Heights riot in Crown Heights, New York, suburb of New York City. A rabbi's car, an Orthodox rabbi, his car hit and I think killed a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And then the neighborhood sort of erupted, and it was a big, you mentioned earlier the sort of the tension between African Americans and Jews who live in neighborhoods close by, and that was sort of
this element of that. I mean, and so why I bring this up is I don't know. I think we are connected on Facebook. A lot of people, when Kanye last year
Mhm.
was saying what he was saying, and this is not me kind of, co-signing on anything that Kanye says,
Right.
but not really understanding that Kanye's anti-Semitism is not new within the Black community.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it has some measure of its origins in other dynamics. I would remind people, like, Michael Jackson also, as much as he associated with Jews, had his own form of anti-Semitism. All you have to do is listen to "They Don't Really Care About Us," and one of the
Mhm.
things he says is "kick me, kike me," right, which is a
Right.
derogatory term for Jews. Um, so there are these things that are happening again in figuring out who's us, who's them,
Yeah.
and that's a measure of the history. And that makes sense, Nandi, that he would be Haitian. That is still a very strong Caribbean neighborhood.
Yeah.
Crown Heights still is part of it. One part of it is. The other part is still Jewish. So
Yeah.
it's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, this wasn't too long after Public Enemy in '89 had their own problems. There was an interview with Professor Griff from Public
Mhm.
Enemy where he said some unflattering things about Jews, and then I saw Public Enemy live not long after that, and they were still suffering with the sort of there was a lot of blowback over that.
And then
And
Farrakhan, the association with Farrakhan, especially for Griff.
yeah, exactly, yeah. And so yeah, that became a whole sort of crisis for Public Enemy in '89, '90,
Hmm.
at the height of all that. So yeah, it is this ongoing sort of side issue on top of the big problem.
Yeah.
At the same time, around the same week, there was yet another prison riot. This is in Talladega, Alabama. Another sort of racially motivated inmate uprising that got really ugly in Alabama this summer. And yeah, this just continuing with the deaths of famous musicians during these times. Miles Davis dies during the Red Five. The same Red Five that took Cannonball Adderley and John Coltrane. And okay, so now we're at Anita Hill. Remember, I told you, um, 24 years earlier in 1967, during the Red Five, Thurgood Marshall became the first Black Supreme Court justice, and so now he's stepped down, and he's supposed to be replaced by Clarence Thomas. And there's a hearing for Clarence Thomas, and along comes Anita Hill to make everything awkward. In the To put it mildly,
Uh-huh.
she comes and testifies that Clarence Hill has been had sexually harassed her on numerous occasions when they worked together a few years earlier. And this becomes this huge, it's all televised. And for the first time on live TV, we're hearing, phrases like pubic hair and just,
Coke
you know,
camps.
yeah, Coke can.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, in 1991, we were still the public was still relatively prudish. This is pre-internet, so all the details advanced on live TV during these hearings were somewhat scandalous for the time, I'd say. Wouldn't
Yeah,
you say, Sam?
yeah, it is, and then behaving is saying, yeah, she's still taking flack for speaking the truth.
Oh
In
yeah, for
terms of
sure.
what happened with Brett Kavanaugh, and the woman who spoke out against him. And what's
Yeah,
fascinating about reflecting on this moment with Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas has pretty much shown as a justice, independent of his decisions and everything. He doesn't give a fuck about what anybody says about what he wants to do. That cavalier sensibility that Anita Hill was describing,
yeah,
it has pretty much come to the forefront in terms of, him taking expensive trips, you know, um, things that he shouldn't be doing, questioning the ethics of his stewardship, particularly. You could
right.
probably look at others, but it's interesting to kind of see he's revealed himself. And what's fascinating is that Clarence Thomas pretty much didn't start speaking in terms of, or weighing in with questions until like a few years ago.
Yeah,
he had been a justice for 20-something years or so before pretty much he would even ask a question during a hearing.
Yeah, he really would not say very much at all.
Yeah. So now we're seeing not only did she say the truth then, but manifestations of who he is now, especially with his wife's shenanigans and everything else.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, of course, it's the only thing to water all that down. It turns out many of the justices, right or left wing, have been now found to be like accepting vacations that they
Yeah.
probably shouldn't be, and all this stuff. Like, you know,
Yeah, but I think
uh,
he was like the watershed moment with that, right?
yes,
You,
yeah, absolutely.
you know, because I guess he was so blatant about it. But now you're right. We do know that others, whether they're right or left of the aisle,
Yeah,
have that.
yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna just show you something, show you guys something, just to show you the power of this, since we're on the subject here. Um, and aside from the slideshow, to show a different slideshow. Okay, so Thurgood Marshall. Remember, I said he was nominated in September of 67, nominated and confirmed during the Red 5 of 1967. So natally, Thurgood Marshall is a Red 3. All right. And he was appointed by Lyndon Johnson,
Yep.
who was a Red 3. Okay. And then, so Thurgood Marshall, who's a Red 3, was replaced then by Clarence Thomas, who is a Red 3.
Oh wow.
Okay.
Also would have
And
been a cancer, right? It makes sense, right?
right. And Clarence Thomas was appointed by
George
George
W.
H.W. Bush,
Yeah.
who is a Red 3.
Wow.
Okay. Okay. And then the fifth person in all this, the person who blew everything up, is Anita Hill, who is a Red 3.
Oh
So
wow.
let me recap. Thurgood Marshall, Red 3. Clarence Thomas, Red 3. Anita Hill, Red 3. Lyndon Johnson, Red 3. George H.W. Bush, Red 3. And then the Red 5s are Thurgood Marshall's appointed in 1967 during a Red 5. Clarence Thomas is appointed to replace him during the Red 5 of 1991.
What do you make
So,
of all that, though?
what am I supposed to make of all that? It's
I mean, like,
nuts.
what do you think that means? I mean, I
Yeah,
have my own thoughts, but I'm gonna hear.
yeah, I do. I do. Well, again, it comes down to the idea of Venus being a consensus. And I think when Venus goes retrograde, these are these moments when the consensus comes up for review. When the Venus retrograde transits are the periods where we can decide on what it is about our consensus, our social consensus, what it is about what we accept and don't accept, what is going to change. So in 1967, it's the simple idea of you've never had anything but white men serve on the Supreme Court, and suddenly you're not having a white man serve on a Supreme Court. And that's a changing consensus right there, you know, just the optics of it all. But then when we get to Anita Hill, you know, it's not necessarily quite the same novelty that Clarence Thomas is also a black man. I mean, it's important, but he's not the first. And so it doesn't have that kind of watershed moment to it. But Anita Hill complaining about, you know, with her grievance against Clarence Thomas, this is also a sort of Venus retrograde moment. This is you know, these moments that make people uncomfortable, these moments when we're suddenly talking about things on TV that people don't usually talk about. These are also sort of Venus retrograde moments. I mean,
Well,
it really was. Today, we're really used to people calling out, you know, sexual assault or sexual harassment, but this was really something new when she did this, wasn't it?
right.
This was not something that happened in the culture. Women did not speak out about this kind of thing until Anita Hill did.
Have you
I can't think of a precedent. I can't think of a precedent.
Well, we could weigh in more with that because I think there's more there. Have you looked at Katanji's Browns?
Yes, she's a red too.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. She's a red too. I didn't look at when she was actually confirmed. It sort of blew by me, so I don't have the date of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that also has some significance. But I think what you're also making as, an argument here. I mean, you didn't say it explicitly. When we're looking at their births,
Hmm.
we're also talking about perhaps like the articulation of a destiny. Not only in terms of what that moment means, but what that
Right.
also could, as a spool, be spun to mean some years later. Because when we're looking at their births, there's a not only a correlation to how these men, for instance, like with George W. Bush, and then also in terms of Thurgood Marshall and Lyndon Baines Johnson, there's a way in which they're kind of tied together toward a moment or series of moments that's articulated even in the beginning, which is, I think, the real basis of astrology.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it is. It's it gets kind of mind-boggling to contemplate. But I see what you're getting at. They all show this potential right from birth, and just the way it all sort of unravels, and the different personalities, play their roles, and we get to these seminal moments like Anita Hill testifying here. But yeah, I mean, there's Venus retrograde all over the incident. Everything from the white black dynamic to the man woman dynamic, and the way all these sort of accept these entrenched attitudes are getting sort of shaken up, and some things that have never been said are suddenly being said out loud.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. I know you've only got about 8 minutes or something, right? Don't you
That's
have to?
correct.
Yeah.
So why
So
don't we look at a few more, unless you want to pause or something? We can get
no, I'll go through a bit more.
the 90s, get through the 90s at least.
Yeah, we'll get through the '90s, and then next week, I guess. Hopefully, you can join me next Monday, and we finish this slideshow, and we go into your slideshow.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
sounds good.
that sounds really good.
All right. So I mentioned Tupac earlier. Tupac isn't killed during the Red Five, but the thing that sort of leads up to, ostensibly probably leads up to his murder, is what was called the hip hop wars of the summer of 1995 during the Blue Five. Just it started harmless enough, with just some back and forth between East Coast and West Coast hip hop figures at the hip hop awards, but then things got ugly, and the lines were drawn, and yeah, by September of '96, Tupac was killed, and then in March of '97, Biggie Smalls was killed, and that was sort of, I think it all it erupted from what was going on this summer during this Blue Five, the hip hop wars, and angry words being thrown back and forth. Um,
Chuck Knight was just born just after Venus became an evening star. What would that be?
Suge Knight was born, I think he's April 1966, isn't he?
Yeah. But
He's got a morning star Venus. He would be
April
born.
19th, 1965. I have.
Oh, is he 65? I know that, like, that was a controversial thing. So yeah, in April 65, that is a blue one, and that's when Venus has just become an evening star. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's a blue one, which is sort of, yeah, in a way connected to this blue five. Tupac himself was a blue five, or he's a black one going on a blue five. He's on the border, the cusp between black one and blue five as well.
Yeah, because we don't have a time for him. Is that right?
No, yeah,
Right.
yeah. He's a Gemini born in '71, so he was born just before the blue five. Or yeah, I think he might be a blue five. I'm trying to remember. He's right at the edge between sorry, a white one and a blue five, not a black
Yeah,
one.
Nandy, we don't have a time for him.
Yeah.
So we can't say he's an Aries ascendant. We don't know what he is.
No, no. Okay, so this is the era of the OJ trial. So OJ wasn't arrested during a Venus retrograde or anything like that, but this is a really important moment in the OJ trial, and the one that's sort of most mask off with regard to sort of the racism behind the LAPD, and all the other sort of subtext hovering around OJ Simpson. Because really, I don't know what you think, Sam, but to me, the OJ Simpson trial isn't so much a murder trial, but it's more it's a trial to see like the whole sort of premise of the American dream is you're supposed to make enough money to be able to murder someone and get away with it.
I
Right? Like that's the ultimate sort of white privilege. If you're rich enough, you're supposed to be able to kill someone and get away with it. And the problem was that, you know, OJ Simpson's very rich, very successful. And he's supposed to be just like any white man in his station. He's supposed to be able to kill someone and get away with it. And for some reason, they just weren't let him getting away with it, as if like, you know, putting someone on trial for murder is
well, I mean, there's so many different nuances of this. I mean, like
yes,
one of the things
yeah,
to go back to is his marriage to Nicole Brown Simpson, right?
sure,
And his marriage, even though you know it was more, I mean, he had been married to a black woman. Then he marries this, you know, blonde hair white woman from who, I mean, he was born in Germany, but she's American.
yeah,
And so it was a different idea of integration of the dream.
hmm
And I think on some level we could see like, oh well, this, you know, you only can go so far with this idea of the dream, marrying a white woman, blah blah blah. And then when she's murdered brutally, as well as
suddenly he's a black guy again.
he's a black guy again, you know, being
Right? Yeah,
chased by the police in a
yeah,
Bronco,
yeah,
right? And I think there's some measure of that. You know, in terms of his trial, I'll say this. Um, Even though he was not convicted and he was acquitted, I always have felt that he knows who did it, though, if he didn't do it. I think there's always
yeah.
a question of like, well, I don't know if you're completely innocent, buddy, but yeah, he didn't get away with murder.
Okay. I think he got away with murder, but I think it was there was no way if they had convicted him, you would have had a real shit show in the country. And so
Hmm.
I think they sacrificed justice just to sort of, you know, keep the peace. And my feeling was that everyone knew that, but that, you know, it had to be this way
Well,
because
yeah, because they're
this is what I mean. Like
LA riots. We didn't talk about even. I mean, not yet, but we didn't talk
yeah,
about
well,
Rodney King.
we'll come. Yeah, we will come back to Rodney King and the riots,
Mhm.
and that absolutely informs everything that's happening here with this case. But yeah, I always thought that it was, you know, it wasn't about whether or not OJ Simpson was guilty. It was just that, you know, he is supposed to be able to get away with murder because usually white men in his position do, and therefore, you know, everything's got to be even.
Right.
That was how I took it. You know. Um, yeah. Anyway, um, in the middle of all this, Mark Furman, who was, you know, one of the police officers investigating O.J. Simpson, he's revealed to be a really, you know, racist POS. And
Yeah.
this tape comes out, and he, you know, it's N word this and N word that, and it just sort of, yeah, it underscores. I mean, it's stuff like this that really sort of puts things in motion for Simpson to be acquitted when the time comes. You know, because you have evidence like this, and yeah, with it's sort of it's irrelevant that, you know, in some sense that Simpson's guilty because the police force investigating him is so corrupt and so biased that there's no way things can be fair anyway.
Yeah. And
Oh
Nandy, to answer your question, so Nicole Brown Simpson is a Taurus. Would make
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, I've got her somewhere. I think she's a
yeah. I have it. I have it handy. She's a Taurus. Oh, now I don't have it handy. I got rid of it. But
I do hear I think she's a OJ by the way is a blue 5. So was Johnny Cochran. They were both blue 5. So you saw that that whole Mark Fuhrman incident was also during a blue 5.
yeah.
And then yeah, Nicole Brown Simpson, I'll have her up in just a moment.
Oh, and also, you know, people are asking, is there? So this is part two. There will be
This
a
is part
part
2
three.
and there's going to be a part 3
There's going to be
and
a
who
part
knows,
three.
part 3 maybe even a part 4
I think we're going
if
to put
we were
part four. Maybe we'll take a
yeah.
2 week break after that. But we'll
Okay,
meet
here
next week. We're
yeah, this is Nicole Brown
Yeah.
Simpson. So
So
you can see she's
she's
a
a Pisces rising, right? She's a Pisces
yeah,
rising with a moon in Libra.
yeah. And she was born about a month before um a red 5 interval. She's a black 1 interval.
Yeah.
All right, well, shall we leave it there?
we should leave it there. Thank you all who have tuned in.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
We'll meet together next week, around the same time, and Nick will finish his part of the show. I think there's still just, I mean, we're
Not that much more.
Yeah, we're heading into the 21st century. Shouldn't be that much more. And then I'll do my part, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Fantastic. Sam, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, everybody.
Today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed that. Yeah, this has been great. Thank you, Sam. What's your website? How do people find you?
Unlockastrology.com.
Okay, unlockastrology.com for Sam Reynolds. I'm Nick Dagan Best at nickdaganbestastrologer.com. Check us out, get in touch, and yeah, check us out next Monday. We'll be here at 10 Pacific, 1 o'clock Eastern for our Chapter 3, our third installment of this ongoing competition.
Yeah, we're having fun. All right.
All right. Sam, thank you. Have yourself a great week. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next weekend. Cheers.